there are some people on the call that have joined the USA and the Singapore and are now joining the UK, Europe webinar as well. So I'm delighted that we have so many on the call. And I do thank everybody for their support, whether it's dinner time in Australia or whether it's breakfast time in the UK, Europe. So the purpose of each market spotlight is to give a snapshot of each market so that business leaders have the opportunity from hear from experts on the ground in those markets. And for the UK, Europe, I'm thrilled that in addition to our market industry experts of Eric and Zach, who are scale-up specialists, we also have an opportunity to hear from an internationally acclaimed C-suite human resources executive and an Aussie, Kelly Hartman, and I will ask the team to introduce themselves in a moment. I will let you know that the webinar is being recorded and will be available at FD Global Connections YouTube page. I will be emailing all of you with all the details by the end of the week. For those who have dialed in, I do ask that you turn on your mute button and turn your video off so that we don't have interference issues along the way. Also, I welcome questions. So in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a little chat section. Please send through your questions as we progress, and I will try to get to all of them by the end of the webinar. So today we have the focus or the spotlight on UK EMEA, and I'm delighted, as I said, that I have 3 and 7 and 8. And if you could all make sure that you turn off your mute, please. We've got some activity happening with M. I'm not sure who M is. Thank you. So I'd like to ask each of our guest speakers now to introduce themselves. So Eric, could I hand over to you first, and then Zach, and then Kelly, if I can ask you as well. So Eric, if you wouldn't mind giving yourself an introduction.
Yeah, sure. So thanks a lot for inviting us here. So my name is Eric Haken, sitting in the Netherlands in a small town called Arnhem, near the German border. And I'm a managing director here at a company called Access. We're a Dutch company with a presence basically throughout Europe, and since this year also in the US. So I've been with the company for 9 years. Grew from business development really to all the steps towards managing director right now.
Great, thank you, Eric. And Zach, over to you.
Sure, I'm a regional managing director for Access, looking after the UK and Ireland. Been with the company for just over 2.5 years, spent the last 10 years in software and technology sales. We have an office with, I think it's nearly 15 people now, located in Banbury, just outside Oxford, about an hour from London.
Perfect, thank you, Zach. Yeah. And Cal, over to you, please.
Yeah, so I'm Kelly Hartman. I'm born and bred in Melbourne, Australia, but have lived in London for the last 10 years. Working as a Chief People Officer at Flywire. So Flywire is headquartered in Boston. We have 550 Flymates. So our employees we call Flymates in 12 locations across the world. We actually just acquired a company at the beginning of the year. And we are a payments company that focus on life's most important payments. So whether that is paying your tuition for higher education, healthcare for operations, elective surgery, and also in our travel industry.
Great, thanks, Cal, and do appreciate you joining. I know how busy you must be at the moment with your responsibilities.
All good.
Oh, good. So thank you to the panelists for joining this afternoon or this morning. So Eric, I want to start with you, if I may, and can you give us a general overview of current market conditions in Europe, and obviously with the impact of COVID-19, what are you seeing in terms of business activity and market conditions?
Yeah, sure. So I think around 2 months ago, the COVID-19 became a significant issue here in Europe. I would say, first of all, it started in Italy and quite soon afterwards, it spreads basically throughout Europe. To all other EU countries. I would say that around mid-March, companies started to really make some drastic measurements to make sure that the healthcare infrastructure doesn't run out of their capacity. What we've seen really is that even more now that Europe is not a country, right, and that each country in Europe really took its own measurements and a way to handle this whole COVID and prevent that it's spreading. So, for instance, like you see that Italy, where it started, they chose to really have a massive lockdown. Spain as well, Belgium. However, if you look at, for instance, the Netherlands or in Sweden, it's quite open still. Like restaurants are still open, so they really chose to continue their way of living as normal as possible. In the Netherlands, we chose an intelligent lockdown, which basically means that you give clear guidelines on how you should be acting and how you should avoid, let's say, contact with each other to avoid spreading as much as possible. So you definitely see that there hasn't been a universal approach on how to handle it. Business-wise, what we've seen is that, especially around mid-March, when things got really serious over here and the measurements were just in place. So what we've seen is that the first 1 or 2 weeks was really panic mode. So a lot of companies had to make certain decisions to ensure business continuity, whereas there was a lot of uncertainty. Are we going to close something? Are we, how long does it take, etc., etc. So I think a lot of those questions still arise. But what we definitely have seen in the first 2 weeks, that there was a lot of panic and uncertainty. After the first 2 weeks, things got a bit more stabilized, and we've seen that companies are, especially in the last 2 to 3 weeks, really looking to the future on how to, continue also after this whole situation.
Great, thank you. And moving over to
Maybe,
you, Zach.
just Zach, did you want to say something specifically to the UK?
Yeah, I think Trina was just moving on to me, if that's right, Trina, and then I'll carry on.
Yeah, happy for you to facilitate, Eric. You're doing a great job. So
yeah. So I mean,
UK.
Yeah, from a COVID perspective, I think in terms of measures and lockdowns, Eric's more or less covered it. The UK went into quite a strict lockdown, but relatively self-enforced. So there's no real police or restrictions other than if people are out sunbathing or doing obviously stupid stuff during the lockdown period, then the law enforcement come involved. Unlike places like Italy or Spain, where it's been really strict with military and police really enforcing the lockdown with severe fines for any breaches. From a market perspective, the market entered, a bit like Eric said, a real state of panic, or I've used the word flux in my notes, mid-March. But before that, it really was booming. The whole economy has been booming for quite a while, and that's obviously been good for everyone. And we experienced a state of panic for probably 1 or 2 weeks, and then the business leaders, that at least the ones we've been working with, sort of suddenly became far more open. We've been having a lot more meetings. We're seeing that a lot of businesses, that at least those in the sectors or industries that have only been partially or completely unaffected by the economic impacts of COVID, things are moving forwards, and a lot of the companies are looking at how they can meet the new demands that the change in working from home has created, and obviously e-commerce demands and digital demands. It's a little early to say how COVID will perhaps impact purchasing and acquisition of new technologies and new solutions, which obviously could impact scale-up companies, which is what we're here to talk about today. But we do expect that while the markets continue moving, budgets might be, from the C-level people that I've been speaking to, budgets might be reallocated towards projects that meet COVID demands, as opposed to what they may have been pushed towards larger strategic projects. So in a IT perspective, digital transformation perspective, any tech that's helping in those areas, automation, really it's a good opportunity for business leaders to focus on expanding into Europe, because all of this C-suite and the decision makers are no longer rushing, as Kelly just explained to us at the beginning before everyone joined, from event to event, country to country, meeting to meeting. They're also at home and have availability to talk about new technology and new ideas. And that's led to an awful lot of new opportunities. They've actually come off the back of COVID, for us, at least in the UK, which has been great.
Yeah. That's interesting, and it also resonates with what we heard on our Singapore webinar, where it's easy at the moment to get meetings with C-suite executives, even on weekends, which is very unusual, because at the moment they're sitting at home, they've got time, they're not rushing from meeting to meeting or commuting. So so that's a very consistent message that I'm hearing all around the globe. How communication, with your role as Chief People Officer at Flywire, the value of and importance of communication during times of crisis, particularly where there's panic, as Zach and Eric have mentioned. So from what you see, what works well when it comes to communication with employees, and what should companies avoid doing?
Sure. So one of the key takeaways for us straight away was we set up a Tiger team. So the Tiger team was our COVID response team, and that comprised of our CEO, our Chief Security Officer, our Chief Legal Officer, and also myself. And from there, we met daily to look at how we communicate back to our people, because they were asking questions like, are you going to close our offices down? And we saw that in the market, things were changing very rapidly. So at first, what we did straight away is we started off having Q&As nearly, every day for employees to ask any question they wanted. And believe me, they asked some really tough questions and continued to do so, because it's really important that you're transparent as possible when you're talking with employees. And that means, hitting the hard questions and avoid promising things that you can't deliver on. So if for example, our flymates are asking, will all our jobs be safe? We can't 100% say yes, because we just don't know what's going to be happening in the market. So avoiding the hard questions is one of the big things. One of the other things is really fine-tuning our communication styles. We've built a very open and transparent culture, which is, one of the reasons I love Flywire so much. So we quickly inform, employees of any decisions we're going to make very quickly. And we have an influx of, as I said, questions all the time. So we have Q&As. We do a lot of one-on-ones. I spend my mornings just picking random flymates to speak to check in, and we have a lot of channels for different people. So what I mean is Mike, our CEO, like this week, and we're arranging this, we'll do roundtables, sometimes similar to what we do in our offices. He may just say, hey, first 10 people to put a thumbs up in one of the Slack channels, I'll meet you downstairs and take you for lunch, or I'll take you for coffee. So sometimes spontaneously I might be in a meeting with him and he'll go, he'll Slack everyone in the channel in our all company and say, hey, anyone want to join a hangout? And sometimes we may get 50 to 100 people joining. So we have a lot of communication channels like that. We do a lot of virtual hangouts. Sometimes we do virtual games. We have channels for fitness. We have channels for solo, so people that are living solo or people that have got new parents. So there's a lot of a lot of virtual chats, and sometimes it's really important, and we provide a lot of training for our managers just to check in on people. So to avoid always the business results and focusing on the business, just how are you is one of the big things that we're teaching people, you know, and be vulnerable too. Like, it's very important that the executives are going through this as well, and we share with our employees, you know, the struggles that sometimes we have. So, you know, that we know that, you know, everyone is human. I find that at the moment, you know, employees are going through different stages, and people are, you know, struggling balancing homeschooling and schooling, you know, homeschooling and full-time work, or people are struggling living so far away from their families and friends and living alone. And you've got to really tap in and know that everyone is an individual, and they're dealing with things differently. So a lot of empathy and a lot of understanding and a lot of flexibility. There's no size that fits all, you know. And I think one of the questions we get all the time is like, are we expected to be as productive as we've been because we're balancing other things in our life and a pandemic? And we're constantly saying, you know, not at all. Like, you know, you work with your manager, you work with people and culture to work with what is great for you. And I think, as my CEO, he constantly says, if we're focusing on productivity and we're not focusing on the well-being and you know, the safety and the care for our employees, we're focusing on the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I did have a question for you around productivity a little bit later on, but I'm going to ask it now, Cal, because you've led nicely into that. And so how do you, particularly a global organisation like Flywire, how do you ensure that your employees do remain engaged and productive while also acknowledging these other, you know, life-threatening issues that they're facing all over the globe within Flywire?
Sure. So as I said, we understand that productivity might not be at its peak right now, and we have empathy for employees who are juggling all these different roles and responsibilities because, you know, of childcare or an elderly person or even a death or sickness in the family, which has happened, right? So we have to understand that achieving business as usual to the greatest extent possible will look a little different, and we have to reset our goals and expectations. So we're constantly having one-on-ones, and managers are having one-on-ones. There's more team meetings, you know, we constantly give updates on the business results, and, you know, even re-looking at our goals and strategy. You know, as I mentioned before, we have a travel industry vertical, although, you know, as I mentioned prior to this, like, people are still trying to, not predict, but they're still trying to focus on what happens after. And so luckily, you know, people are still, you know, trying to book their holidays and heli skiing holidays and trips to Japan. But I think we have to look at, you know, different strategies, and we have to change our goals. For my whole team, for example, you know, there was a lot of, you know, we had an acquisition. We were doing in-person onboarding, which is called the Flying Start program. And that's when, you know, all our new employees come to Boston for a week and the executives present. So what we've had to do is, you know, change those goals and make sure that that onboarding, you know, will look slightly different, and it's going to be virtual. And that means 2 hours a day rather than a whole day. So I think every part of the business has to have reset their goals to focus on what's going to work for the business now. And I think, you know, most importantly, you have to put your money where your mouth is. So if you say to the employees that, you know, they come first, you've got to demonstrate it. So for us, safety and well-being of our flymate is our priority. And, you know, as I said, we've done everything from virtual groups to giving them stipends to setting up a home office to, you know, to buy subscriptions to Headspace and Calm, which are meditation apps, and, you know, wellness. And we have a wellness committee, and we've just set up, you know, an employee system program, which is 24/7, you know, counseling services for those that it's not covered, you know, in their health insurance. So again, we do different things, and of course we're still focusing on getting the business going, and we've got tiger teams looking at different parts of our business. But you've got to adapt your goals, and you've got to have some flexibility and empathy for people, because if it's just on productivity, and I hear horror stories that, you know, there's people that ring me and ask guidance because their CEOs are so focused on productivity, they want to test how many hours people are working, you know, on their computers and things like that. Like, I'm horrified by that, because if you did that, people are going to get more anxious and they're going to get less focused. So you've got to do everything to help your employees keep focused, give them the tools, give them the supports, and then go from there. And then productivity will keep going. You know, I think Zach said it before, and Eric, like, you know, productivity isn't lost. You know, we're still focusing, and people are probably working longer hours than ever. So we're trying to get people not to have a continuous day at work. You know, I said today, you know, myself, like, I work Boston hours a lot, so I'm up until like midnight, 1 o'clock working. But that means in my mornings, usually, I go for a walk and take calls for like 3 hours because I know that I've got a long day ahead. And everybody's hours are changing. I know, you know, my PNC business partner in Israel, she's got 4 kids. She has to homeschool. Like, that's nearly impossible. So her working day starts at 2 o'clock. And so, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Cal. Eric and Zach, Cal talked a lot about communication and how you're having to change communication plans and strategies within organizations. But in terms of companies, the strategies that companies are taking, you're seeing many pivots in your respective markets. So, for example, in Australia, we're seeing a lot of beer brewers now turn into hand sanitizing companies. So are you seeing pivots in your region, Eric? And then I'll throw over to you, Zach.
Yeah, so actually we've seen the same with whiskey brewers.
Okay.
But overall, yeah, again, it really differs per country. So, you know, emphasizing that Europe is, again, not another country, and each market has their own pivots in that sense. But what we generally see, you know, it also really depends on the vertical that you're in, right? So some verticals, some companies in those verticals have been heavily impacted, like, you know, events, sports, travel, etc. So, you know, they just have been heavily impacted. But what we see overall is that if you can, a lot of companies are switching their focus to be an online player, and whereas some are already pure players, so their whole business model was already online. So, for instance, if you look at the retail industry, so a lot of companies that were focused on either omni-channel or just the brick and mortars, they are, you know, going to an online environment straight away. If you look at, for instance, restaurants, they all became takeaway companies. If you look at, you know, the grocery stores over here, home delivery has been increasing, you know, a lot, I can say. So it's interesting to see that a lot of the tech companies that we are representing, which are selling in towards these industries, they are also adjusting quite nicely to, you know, the new strategies that companies have. So just like a random example, so we have a company that sells a ticketing system technology towards like amusement parks and big type of events. Well, you know, you can imagine that's not really the best of industries to be in. So what they've done is they switched their technology within a week, really, like within the whole a week, they completely shifted to sell towards like, for instance, grocery stores, to manage the traffic coming in on these stores.
Oh, wow.
So that's really interesting to see that a lot of the companies that we are representing, which we're selling towards, let's say, industries which are, you know, hit or also have changed their model, they, you know, adjusted. And I think that's the nice thing about our industry and technology. You know, you're more flexible in that sense to adapt.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And Zach, in UK, Ireland, I would imagine you're seeing pivots as well, and also interested in what Eric said around that tech company and how they've really pivoted into an entirely different industry, into supermarkets.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the UK side, as a core, most businesses have been looking at sort of 4 key things, at least initially during the panic phase, and then ongoing now in terms of what they can do next. It's looking after their staff, which Kelly's kind of already talked about, in terms of how they can keep them employed or use the furlough schemes to avoid having to make redundancies. Improving efficiency internally, it's a good chance to look at all your processes, and then reducing costs and looking at new opportunities, which they may have ignored. What we've seen in terms of pivots is big engineering brands, companies like Dyson, McLaren F1, Rolls-Royce, Airbus have all kind of joined the collective cause to deliver on alternative ventilators, which was a big demand at the beginning of all of this, as well as other sort of tech solutions. And now I think they're producing something like 1,000 a day through a consortium that was created off the back, which obviously is quite a testament to UK engineering to be doing that in the space of less than a month. Additionally, fashion brands like Barbour, I don't know if it's a well-known brand in the rest of the world, but they make luxury coats, and now they're producing PPE equipment for the NHS, which is quite interesting as well, of course. And it shows really how quickly these businesses are innovating, which is obviously something we talk about a lot as Exus, innovating to deliver on different requirements. And then another one is a bit like Eric said, the supermarkets have kind of, the change in market behavior towards supermarkets has been kind of crazy, really, in terms of increased demand, which is not just people stockpiling, it's the fact that people aren't eating out anymore or using, going to restaurants or going to Boots or Tesco's, one of the local convenience stores for their lunch. And yeah, I mean, Ocado, which is a large online delivery service across several supermarkets in the UK, thought they were experiencing a denial of service attack when the lockdown implemented, but it was actually just everyone going onto their website to try and book delivery slots. So the supermarkets have really partnered with a number of tech firms to increase capacity, and I think they've kind of doubled or even tripled the amount of delivery services they can offer, and the online capacity through improvements in efficiency combined with more workers, which obviously has been a big change. At a sort of enterprise or SME level, a bit like Eric said, a lot of the pubs and restaurants are pivoting towards takeaway or sort of providing community-based services, which has been really quite nice to see. And then there's been businesses that you wouldn't think would necessarily have done quite so well out of this, but logically it probably makes sense. You can't buy a bicycle for love nor money in the UK at the moment. All the bike stores, Halfords, have sold out. One of my colleagues keeps mentioning how difficult he's finding it to get a bike. So it's interesting to see what businesses are really doing well. Home fitness, people doing fit on YouTube and things like that are really sort of flying at the moment. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see how it adapts as we go forward as well. And I think the real pivots are going to come over the next few weeks. We're going to start seeing a lot of tech companies focusing in on how they can move towards new market demands. Obviously, the big guys are already doing it. WhatsApp have just changed to 8 people video calling. Zoom are bringing out new features every day. But I think there'll be a lot of small companies that spot gaps and really look to accelerate into new opportunities.
Yeah, and cyber security is one that is getting a lot of attention as well at the moment. There is a lot more hacks happening, certainly in Australia is what we're hearing. Is that also happening in UK and Europe?
Eric, do you want to go first, or shall I?
Yeah, no, so definitely, and also we see. So we represent, I would say, about 20 companies which are acting in the field of cybersecurity, and that's quite an interesting market to be in right now. So we see a lot of companies being hacked, and they are taking the necessary measurements to prevent it or to cope with it.
Yeah, exactly. Eric, I'm going to stay with you just for the minute. So, in terms of we have online businesses in fintech and insurtech and regtech on the line listening. So, in terms of financial services industry, are you seeing a shift in buying behaviour, or it might be in line with the cyber? Are there more focus on upholding regulations in the fintech financial services industry at the moment? I'm curious how that particular industry is dealing with COVID-19.
Well, I think, like you said it, so it is an interesting field also to be in right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
from the UK perspective, maybe just to jump in on that question, from fintech, we work with quite a few fintech partners, and we're certainly seeing, in conversations I've had with a couple of CIOs recently, that the neo or challenger banks, I won't give examples because that would give away who I'd spoken to, but you get who I mean. The app-based banks have sort of hinted that they're worried that maybe some of the investor activity will slow down a little bit. So they're being a bit more cautious with what they're looking to do new projects wise. In parallel, a lot of the more established banks and challenger banks, tier 2 banks, are really increasing activity because they're, at the end of the day, the financial services industry is still heavily required in this scenario. I think a lot of the fintech banks have been focused on cross-border and the ability to do easy transactionless or costless payments across border, which is obviously going to dry up, I think, or reduce with everything that's going on and people not moving around. So that's why they're potentially a little bit more uncertain times for these guys. From a technology perspective, I think a lot of the fintech solutions that are out there are more and more, the conversations we've been having have been more and more around user experience and digital transformation, because the banks are realizing that they really haven't focused on this area, at least in Europe, compared to their challengers. And now's the time perhaps to look at some of these projects more closely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of risk, so obviously every company is struggling with COVID. From a people perspective, what's your advice to businesses as they try to navigate the risk management aspects in their business, but also balance that with the welfare of their employees?
Sure. So as I said before, I would recommend, if anyone doesn't have a tiger team or a response team, to set one up, because I think that's the biggest, because, in that meeting we're looking at the welfare of our staff and the communications, but we're managing the risk every day. So the risk, we talk about business risk, and the reason why we don't have our whole executive as part of that group is because we need them to focus on, keeping to sell into their verticals and really, driving the business forward. So it's key that you keep the right people focused on what they need to do, and then the others focus on balancing the risk of the risk of the business, but also the people. We also, as Zach and Eric talked about, we're having a lot of cybersecurity. There's a lot more phishing. There's a lot more, people trying to get into our employees and trying to get information from our employees too. So we do a lot of communications and updates and emails about what to do in those circumstances. So that's how we manage the risk of our business. The same as, for example, now we're looking at, okay, we've got offices in Shanghai, and our Shanghai office, who have been into lockdown for most of the year, we're looking at how do we get them back into the business safely. So on a rotation program, 2 or 3 people in an office, because we've got a small office in Shanghai at a time, and on a rotation, making sure we've got gloves, gloves, masks, sanitizers. So, but not forcing, again, looking at the well-being, like if you don't want to go back to work, we're not forcing you to go back to work. So again, that's how you have to balance, because people are saying, hey, but I've still got kids to look after. I really don't feel safe yet because, I've got old parents that I live with. We're never going to force everyone to go back to work. So again, it has to be looked at a balance of stages. So well-being is always at the front of mind, but also the risk and safety of them, and also the business, right? We also have to, we communicated too, as I said, people are asking, what are we doing? So we are looking at all the options of reduced salaries for executives and senior people. Can we reduce hours for those that are not working at full capacity at the moment? Are there other jobs in the organization they can do? Do we have to go the furlough route, and do we have to go the exit route? So we're looking at all of those options and weighing up what is right for the business and the welfare of our people too.
Yeah, thanks, Cal. It's a delicate balance, there's no doubt about it. And one
Sure.
thing that is coming through a lot of the webinars that I'm on as well is the issue of trust with employees. So you know, if we're talking about all these changes in their HR policies, and it's really difficult for businesses which might be a home-based in Australia, and yet they've got offices and employees offshore, you know, where they haven't got that day-to-day interaction. It's really difficult to do. So the level of trust is absolutely vital for all businesses.
And I think because we are a global business and we're working in like 12 different locations with 60 people working remotely, like we have offices in Australia, like I think the operative word is trust. We've always trusted them to do the right thing, you know, so that doesn't change. We're never checking on how many hours they're working or what hours they're doing. Like you've got to have trust. And I think that's the most important thing. Like you've got to give them flexibility to work what hours, you know, suit them, you know, and we've instilled that culture. So I think nothing has changed in that way. We spend more time, as I said, you know, we've got to be more visible. We've got to do more hangouts. Some people don't want hangouts. They just want a phone call because you get exhausted from Zoom and hangouts all the time. So making sure that they've got that. And the other thing, as I said before, for the well-being and risk, I'm sensing a lot more people with anxiety and depression and things like that just speaking. And I think you wouldn't know that unless I rang them one-on-one and checked to see how they're doing, or you notice something they're saying in a meeting where they're like, hey, I'm struggling at the moment. And then I always make sure that I or the business partners ring them to make sure. We also have a list of every person that has had COVID or has been exposed by their neighbors or someone they work with. And, you know, we have our chief security officer, myself, like checking in on them every day. And we've got to keep that list, even though, you know, sometimes she's like, Kelly, they haven't told me yet, but I'd be on a one-on-one and they've got symptoms, but they think because they've been home for 4 weeks, they don't need to say. But we still want to make sure that their well-being is okay. And as we start getting people back to work, we've got to know if they've been exposed, you know, prior to them coming back as well. So I think that's, again, where you balance. Of course, it's all about the well-being, making sure that they're right, but you also need to check the well-being of the rest of the business. And, you know, so there's the balance and the well-being. And as I said, bringing in an EAP or psychological support or people to do that, again, you know, the well-being of our employees is of the utmost important. And although I studied psychology, I can't be a counsellor for 500 people. And you need the professionals to come in, and managers, you know, you need to equip them too, because they feel obligated and they're not even equipped to handle some of the stuff that people are experiencing at the moment. That's a very important thing. Yeah,
absolutely. Great point, Cal. Zach and Eric, I want to turn to investor activity. So what we've seen in other markets is definitely a lull in investor activity, but it also depends on at what stage the business is at. So Eric or Zach, perhaps Zach, if you want to go on this first on this one, and then I'll throw to
sure.
Eric.
So two of our UK-focused clients, one based in Russia and one based in Belgium, have secured additional funding. So they're already established since the COVID started. Obviously, they were looking into that way before COVID, but the funding has been approved and delivered, which I guess is a real positive that it hasn't seen a complete stop to that activity.
And so, sorry, can I just butt in there? What stage was that business at? You mentioned that they're already in the process of scaling up. So was that a Series A, Series B investment?
It was Series A with one, and the other one is VC, angel investing, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So we haven't seen investor activity grind into a halt, but equally we have seen one partner who's focused on more event technology. Their round didn't close, if that makes sense. They weren't able to establish Series A, Series B. So I think that's probably understandable, given that the events industry is probably going to be the most heavily impacted, or one of the most heavily impacted sectors, alongside sort of hospitality and retail. Equally, we are seeing a lot of new tech startups kind of quite bullish in the market. It's not clear whether they've necessarily received new investment rounds, but it feels that way. So maybe there has been quite a bit of activity there. Eric, maybe you've got some more to add?
Yeah, no, so I think we're seeing overall the same trend here. So some investments that are not going through right now or are being postponed until further notice, so to say. They're still investigating on can we invest in such a tech company. And on the other hand, we definitely see companies that are in remote working, ad tech, e-health, online marketing, e-commerce, cybersecurity. So we across the board, we still see a lot of investments that are being done in companies that we represent. But on the other hand, some are also pushed a bit. I think the overall trend is like it's more niche investments which people are doing right now, rather than let's say the big banks that we've seen happening a lot before as well.
Yeah. And Eric, if I can stay with you in terms of the market innovation.
I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Now I can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Eric, in terms of the countries right across Europe, are you seeing any countries which are more active in terms of investors, or are there particular industries which are becoming more dominant in markets? So, for example, is health tech, med tech more dominant in Italy, for example, at the moment, or Spain?
Sorry, I completely missed the question because you were.
Oh, I logged out.
Maybe it was maybe it was my internet. I don't know, but.
Okay. Zach, can you hear me?
Yeah, I heard. Do you want me to have a go at answering the question, and maybe we can kind of take it from there?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
I completely missed it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the question was really which sectors are experiencing investor activity, and is it different based on markets? For example, is Italy receiving a lot of health tech investment or activity, or different? I think from a UK perspective, sadly, I haven't got enough data to really answer that question very well. I don't know if you've got any more than that, Eric. I know you're a bit more closer to the pulse of some of these things.
Well, yeah, especially the companies that we are representing. So the scale up type of tech companies that create something innovative, something disruptive. It doesn't really matter where they are, right? So as long as so we've seen companies from Russia, as Zach mentioned, from the Netherlands, from the UK. So it doesn't really matter where they are, and as that it's quite scalable technology. So we're not seeing per se a trend that healthcare tech in Italy is more booming than, let's say, in the Netherlands. And so it's more like the general focus of a tech company in a vertical that is, I would say, booming. That's what we're seeing.
Interesting. So in terms of Ireland, Zach, Ireland has had a great reputation for startups and innovation and so forth. And so is that something that has continued through COVID, or has you seen a decline in innovation in Ireland? It's got a great global reputation as an innovation nation.
Yeah, I mean, Ireland's obviously well known for being a place where a lot of tech companies set up a headquarters. I think a lot of that's to do with sort of the infrastructure and the tax policies that they've implemented. I think it's probably too early to say what the impact of COVID will be on that industry and that sector within Ireland. However, it's sort of prior to it, it's continued to grow, and we haven't seen any companies go into sort of hibernation from the Irish startup community. So I think things are kind of continuing to grow and thrive, particularly in tech. I think of all the industries, really, tech, and regardless really of the sector, aside from perhaps event tech or hospitality tech, the businesses are doing okay or continuing to grow. If anything, the traditional enterprises are looking to tech now at how that they can solve all of their problems, whether it's remote working, implementing new digital products and services quickly, or focusing on, if you've been a bank or a retail store that's focused on bricks and mortar, now you really need to pivot very fast to e-commerce if you haven't done before. And that's kind of the industry trend we're seeing in terms of new projects that are kicking off.
Yeah, it's interesting that businesses are really open for business, if you like, around you know, that lull that businesses went through initially when we all had to respond to COVID, but now we're really getting back into productivity, taking calls on weekends for sales purposes and so forth. So it's been quite an interesting place to watch. Zach, I'm just going to stay with you. So in terms of your advice for foreign businesses, looking to scale into Ireland and the UK, what's your advice to them at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was looking at it before, obviously depends what sector you're focused on or what your technology is based on. But I would still look to continue. I think at the beginning of any new adventure into a new market or a new territory, the first thing you want to be having is conversations with potential customers to understand the market fit for your product, what changes you need to make to your product to fit that market, because every market's different, and what tech suits, for example, Australia or the US might need slight adaptations to meet EU regulations or just EU ways of doing, or UK and Ireland ways of doing business. So I think now's a great time from the perspective as we're having more conversations with senior business leaders and decision makers about new technology and new ideas because of the availability. It's almost an opportunity to open a lot of doors much quicker than you would normally, and build that pipeline with clients, which you can then deliver upon in a few months' time when things start to settle down. I don't think we'll be back to the traditional normal for quite a while, but at least as the new normal sort of sets in, people will just get back to new projects and new ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, from your perspective, what's your advice for Australian companies thinking about or already started to scale? What's advice that you would give them?
Well, yeah, again, so Europe is not a country. So that's really how I would consider going to Europe, because, you know, if you go to Spain, for instance,